Welcome to this industry update webinar on the Grenfell Tower Public Inquiry final report. It's going to be presented by myself, Richard Harral. I'm the Chief Executive of CABE, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Hywel Davies, CABE's Head of Technical Insight. The presentation today will be in two parts, two sessions. The first session will look at the Phase 2 report key evidence and findings. This is a factual summary intended to convey the fundamental facts that have been evidenced during the Grenfell Tower report. And then there'll be a break, followed by a second session, which will look at two things. It'll try and pull out some of the key lessons that need to be learnt from the evidence presented to the inquiry. And then it will actually look at the Phase 2 report specific recommendations, which are relevant to CABE membership, which primarily focus on buildings and the built environment in terms of construction, rather than the fire service issues, and followed by a Q&A. Questions for the session can be asked via Slido, which can be accessed through the details below. So the first session relates to summarising the findings from the Grenfell Tower Phase 2 report. All of the evidence we've presented here is a summary of that presented to the inquiry and not CABE's views or opinions. And we hope that it's going to pull together in one place a fairly clear view of the extent of the end-to-end failure involved in creating the conditions for the Grenfell Tower fire. The inquiry sat for 7 years, the public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire. It gathered more than 1,700 pages of expert testimony and heard hundreds of days of witness and expert testimony. The presentation is intended to highlight some key points, but it's only ever going to scratch the surface. The QR code below should take you through to the evidence assembled by the inquiry. I would particularly encourage you to read evidence relating to fire safety measures delivered by some of the expert witnesses, as it not only relates to the specifics in Grenfell Tower, but is a very clear reminder of the why and the how fire safety measures are intended to work, as well as how they fail to work at Grenfell Tower. We've also provided links in the presentation to Dame Judith Hackett's interim and final reports on building regulations and fire safety for good measure. So let's talk about the background to the fire. Grenfell Tower, as originally constructed, it was inherently low risk in terms of fire spread. It had an in situ concrete frame designed to include measures to avoid progressive collapse post Ronan Point, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why it did actually stand up to the events in June 2017 and remained structurally sound. Had precast wall panels, a single escape stair with a stay put or defend in place fire strategy, no firefighting or evacuation lifts, and was in effect typical of UK high-rise of the time of its construction. Refurbishment works were undertaken over an extended period of time. Most recently, fire doors in common parts were replaced in 2011. Many front doors to individual flats were replaced in 2014, and there was a large-scale refurbishment project in 2016. It was intended to improve the fit of the tower into the local area and give an uplift to local property value, aimed to provide high levels of thermal performance to reduce carbon emissions and residents' heating bills. It consisted of an internal refurbishment of all the apartments throughout, a new rain screen cladding system, and new windows for the entire building. At the time that the work was undertaken, the system of regulation in England and Wales was one established in 1984, which had moved away from a prescriptive system of regulation to a functional system of regulation to allow greater innovation, followed by progressive governments increasing competition between public sector and private sector building control bodies to improve service delivery. The functional system relied on people making reasonable provision against functional requirements, but functional systems permit wider range of solutions in return for higher levels of competence amongst those determining how competence needs to be delivered. It's harder to measure and enforce than prescriptive requirements. Competition in the building control sector was increased over time between local authority and approved inspectors, which were private sector building control bodies, but also through the progressive extension of competent person schemes who self-certified what was supposed to be common, high frequency, low risk works. Clients had the choice of who provided their services. And since the early and mid 90s onwards, there was a move towards better regulation and then deregulation, with the system progressively relaxed, clients increasingly exercising disproportionate influence over not only which building control body they chose, but the decisions of that body, and potentially, or arguably at least, an increased conflict of interest in service provision. Up to 2017, fire statistics suggested that holistically, the measures that have been taken in building regulations, in occupational management, in terms of regulations for the fire resistance of fabrics and textiles, furnishings, moves to make cigarettes more extinguishing, etc., had been highly effective. So the statistics suggested that both in terms of fires and in terms of injury and fatality, there was a progressive reduction. And of course, these statistics were ultimately misleading as to the risks that were actually developing. So on the night of the fire was broke out in a kitchen on the fourth floor just before 1 a.m. The tower had a stay put fire policy, so the fire brigade came to address the specific fire without looking at simultaneous evacuation. However, within minutes, the fire had penetrated the window and spread into the external cladding. From the fourth floor, the fire spread up and across the eastern side of the building. It reached the top floor by 126. It had spread to the north side by 142. It had spread from the east side to the south side of the tower by 152. And by 10 past 2, just an hour and 10 minutes after the fire started, multiple fires were burning inside the building, and residents were making their way to upper floors to escape the smoke and heat. By 2:22, the fire had spread to the south side of the building. By 2:47, stay put advice was abandoned by the fire brigade. By 2:51, the fire had reached the western elevation, and by 4:30, the entire building was engulfed in flames. So, an incredibly rapid development and spread of flame. The Phase 1 Grenfell Public Inquiry report dealt with events on the night primarily and highlighted a number of firefighting issues which are worthy of noting for the record. There was a lack of adequate water pressure requiring Thames Water to intervene. There was slow deployment of high ladder facilities. There was a lack of extended duration breathing apparatus, which hampered firefighters. Radio systems were overwhelmed due to the system traffic. There was too much traffic on the radio system. The concrete structure further impeded radio signals, further hampering understanding of the fire's progress. More recent building developments around Grenfell Tower impeded fire service access. Smoke in lobbies and staircase was impenetrable from as early as 18 minutes after the fire started. There was a late realization the fire was out of control and a delay in moving to simultaneous evacuation, and there were no sprinkler systems to help suppress the fire spread or to assist firefighters in getting control. So the question that is most material is how did those circumstances which permitted the fire to spread so catastrophically come to pass? One of the most important lessons and an area of intense scrutiny is the compartmentation failure of the building during this process. Stay put or defend in place strategies are entirely reliant, I think it's fair to say, on compartmentation being effective. Compartmentation should include walls and floors between apartments around all windows and penetrations and within the cladding system at each floor. There were significant failures around openings, particularly around windows and penetrations. The windows deformed under the heat of the fire. The detailing around the windows was weak and included flammable material, and extract fans provided a path for the fire from the interior to the exterior and the exterior to the interior of the building. Fire doors should have had 30 minutes fire resistance, door closers, intumescent and smoke seals. There were no smoke seals on many of the doors. The doors were of an incorrect certification and closers were missing. And there were significant failures within the cladding system. It relied on open state intumescent cavity barriers at each junctions and adjacent to each floor level, many of which were installed the wrong way up, and others were installed with too big a cavity to close. So the tolerances within the cavity had not been managed to ensure that the cavity closers would work. Compartmentation failure allowed extensive smoke spread, which ultimately caused 69 out of the 72 fatalities at the fire. Although the fire in the flat was able to break into the combustible cladding, it was the comprehensive failure in compartmentation that allowed other systems to become overwhelmed and caused the failure of the stay put strategy. The inquiry found that the fire is most likely to have entered the cladding as a result of hot smoke impinging on the window jamb, and also looked very closely at the ACM or aluminium composite material cladding, which was deemed to be the primary mode of fire spread in the cladding system. ACM consists of two thin layers of coloured aluminium sandwiching a filler core. There were three categories: mineral core, Cat 1, which had a fire classification of A2 or A1, depending on the manufacturer. Fire resistant or FR, known now as Cat 2, which had a mixture of polyethylene but also mineral fillers that significantly reduced ability to create an interim standard of fire performance. And polyethylene core, Cat 3, which were pure polyethylene core boards, which had a high flammability, an energy equivalent per square meter to kerosene or paraffin, and displayed what has been described in some places as Jekyll and Hyde characteristics in fire tests. ACM boards are visually indistinguishable from each other, and often calorific testing has to be used to determine which type of board is available, but they can have radically different levels of performance, including depending on the color and shape of the cladding system. The system used at ACM was a Category 3 PE core panel in a cassette system with the edges of the board wrapped backwards, so the exposed polyethylene core faced into the rain screen system. This was specified on the basis of a fire performance test of a riveted system, which is different to this cassette system. The riveted system had a performance at test of B2S3D4. This still didn't comply with building regulations requirements, but the testing of a PE cassette system resulted in disastrous and unrated performance, so performed significantly worse. Combustible insulation was also used on the building. This was marketed as safe to use over 18 meters based on large-scale fire testing reports. 100 to 150 millimeters of the insulation was used to deliver high thermal performance, which added significantly to the fire load or energy load in the cladding system. When tested post-fire, only achieved a Class 1, not Class 0 rating. And certification to BS 8414 was apparently extrapolated from FR 5000 product tests for the RS 5000 product. So as I said, this added significantly to fire load. An expert witness testimony by Dr. Barbara Lane concluded that the cladding, insulation and cavity barriers did not comply with requirements of the building regulations. Fire doors and smaller elements of the building's compartmentation played an important role. Once the fire had spread in the cladding system, the failure of fire doors resulted in escape routes on all floors, including the single stair becoming flooded with smoke. 106 out of 120 individual doors being replaced with new fire doors. When tested post-fire, these new doors failed to meet minimum 30-minute fire tests, and it became clear that the doors as installed did not match the specification um, that had been issued based on the test data, so they were not the same doors in effect. Up to 64% of door closers may have been purposely removed by maintainers because the doors were hard to close. Maintainers told residents closers weren't required, that smoke seals were missing as well, and there was no evidence of effective risk assessment or logical maintenance program, despite concerns being regularly raised by residents. Once the compartmentation started to fail, it triggered activation of the smoke ventilation system, but this was only designed to deal with a fire in a single story of the building. It was a unique system never specified on another building by designers, which needed to retrofit into the existing building voids. So it was designed to meet the constraints of the building. Once fire had spread to other floors, the system was overwhelmed almost immediately. It was only ever designed to cope with smoke and fire on a single story. Automatic vents did not close properly on other floors, so the system did not perform as designed. The inquiry suggests that environmental ventilation systems were not isolated from smoke ventilation system and may have not shut off as required, and also that the system did not comply with the guidance in approved document B, fire safety. As a result, lobbies and the main staircases were rapidly overwhelmed with smoke. In addition, the gas main within the building seems to have been contributing throughout the period of the fire to both the intensity and duration of the fire. The gas main had been upgraded, but was a cause of two distinct issues. The gas pipes breached compartmentation in compartment walls and from lobby to lobby, and were not fully boxed in at the time of the fire, even though the building was occupied. Valves that should enabled isolation of the gas main could not be found and may have been built over during refurbishment. Reports suggest that the fire was only extinguished once the gas main was externally shut down, which again suggests the gas had continued to fuel the fire long after other combustible sources were exhausted. Finally, in terms of the dry and wet risers within the building, the wrong risers had been installed. Building regulations require wet risers installed in buildings over 50 meters. Those installed at Grenfell Tower were dry risers, relying on fire appliance pressure to supply water to the top of the building. It should have had a wet riser supplied from a pressurized tank within the building, and that should have been serviced and available at all times. And this failure in specification and provision was not identified by building control, fire risk assessors, London Fire Brigade, or any of the design team. So a very significant and comprehensive set of failures that ran across pretty much all of the critical systems designed to protect life safety in the building. There were also failures in building management, procurement, and refurbishment. So the inquiry noted a number of specific management failures, targeting the Royal Borough Kensington Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation's responsibilities in particular. There were no plans in place to evacuate disabled people in the event of a whole building fire. The fire risk assessor, the inquiry suggests, was not truthful about their qualifications and competence to undertake the fire risk assessment, and their ability was widely seen as inadequate. There were 280 fire safety actions which had been identified in risk assessments which had not been addressed at the time of the fire. The London Fire Brigade issued a series of fire door deficiency notices. The issues with fire doors were well understood, but delayed or refused, seemingly on cost grounds. So the defects in the fire doors were not addressed. Complaints from residents from 2010 onwards were not addressed, including in relation to fire doors, cladding specification, smoke ventilation. And there were previously identified issues with the smoke ventilation system, which went unaddressed for 6 years despite LFB enforcement notices. The inquiry report reserved some of its sternest criticism for what it called a culture of concealment from RBKC's TMO's management, where important information about fire safety was deliberately withheld, the inquiry suggests, from its own board and those who oversaw its work at the council. The public inquiry report found that there were chronic and systematic failings in the TMO's management of fire safety, and also cited the absence of any independent or rigorous scrutiny by RPKC of the TMO's health and safety obligations. There were failings in the procurement of the building project, and again, RBKC Tenant Management Organisation was extensively criticised in the way that the refurbishment was procured. So, in terms of finance, the client was warned repeatedly that the budget for the refurbishment project was inadequate, but proceeded anyway. The client appointed architects by effectively avoiding um, procurement rules, and because they were already working on the building, and this was in order to save cost and time. This meant that the architect's competence was not checked, despite having no previous skills, knowledge, or experience of this type of work. The contractor appointment also appears to have been part of a rigged procurement, whereby one contractor was given preferential treatment on the basis of making cost savings, which sat outside normal procurement processes. And there was a continual pressure within the supply chain to reduce cost, which led to specification changes, who were led by subcontractors, who themselves were not checked to ensure that they were competent to understand the implications of those changes. The public inquiry suggests that by rigging both appointments and procurement of the main contract, the TMO effectively denied themselves the opportunity to ensure competence, and that there was adequate time and resource to undertake the work in a compliant manner. The report says that the choice of cladding specification was down to the incompetence of the organisations and individuals involved in the refurbishment, and that it did not properly scrutinise the design or choice of materials and failed to satisfy itself that on completion of the work, the building would comply with the requirements of the building regulations. There was extensive responsibility allocated to the design and build contractor, Ryden. They were the main contractor responsible, with considerable responsibility for the fire, the public inquiry states. They provided only a superficial management service with extensive outsourcing, which was absent of proper oversight or evaluation. They failed to put clear contract terms in place at the outset, which laid the ground for further problems. The overall quality of their work fell short of expected standards. They failed to properly manage the complex web of subcontractors and consultants involved in the project, did not manage competence of the supply chain, and made no serious efforts to find out whether the bodies it proposed to engage were competent, did not appoint fire engineers to check the word of Studio E given their lack of experience, failed to monitor design work effectively, and didn't allocate responsibilities clearly or monitor subcontractor work properly, and relied on previous use of products to prove they were safe, with an inappropriate and excessive reliance on building control. Site inspections were inadequate and also failed to detect some serious defects in workmanship. The architects at Studio E were identified by the inquiries bearing very significant responsibility for the fire. We've spoken about difficulties with the way that they were appointed. There are fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the project, its obligation and responsibilities. They assumed subcontractors were solely responsible for the compliance of their work and that the work met the required standards. They had an overriding obligation to client, TMO, and Ryden to ensure work was carried out properly and materials were suitable. They admitted they had not read the relevant sections of building regulations covering fire safety for tall buildings. Again, they over-relied on previous use of insulation and cladding projects as being safe because they had already been used elsewhere, rather than understanding whether, in their own views, those specifications were appropriate. And the project architect was not fully qualified and hadn't undertaken their professional exams, so lacked experience. The public inquiry found that Studio E and Ryden and cladding contractor Harley Facades all took a casual approach to contractual relations. They failed to identify their own responsibilities for important aspects of the design, and in each case they assumed that someone else was responsible for matters affecting fire safety. Harley Facades, the facade subcontractor, were responsible for design, procurement, and installation of the entire cladding system. They had no formal contract to work on the project, meaning legal responsibilities were unclear. They did not concern themselves sufficiently with fire safety at any stage of the refurbishment and didn't believe there was any need to do so. They believed others involved in the project and ultimately building control would ensure the design was safe. Failed to ask questions about materials being used that a reasonably competent contractor should ask. Had a close relationship with Arconic as a supplier, who induced them to buy Rainer Bond 55 PE-ACM at a favourable price. Staff were unaware of the requirements of the regulations for safety and did not understand the underlying testing regime. Accepted use of Celotex RS5000 without checking it could be used safely, or asking any of the members of the design team to do so. And the design for cavity barriers at the point of installation was both incomplete and what had been prepared did not comply with requirements in approved document B. The inquiry states that Harley Facades bears a significant degree of responsibility and failed in many respects to meet the standards expected of a reasonably competent cladding contractor. So this brings us to the end of the first half. I'm going to hand over to Hywel Davies in a moment. But in practice, all aspects of fire safety failed on the 14th of June 2017, leading to a building that was designed on the assumption that it would only have to deal with a single or small localized fire being rapidly consumed by a whole building fire event. This is pretty much end-to-end failure, which is attributable to both the supply chain as a whole, to decisions made by the client, but reflects perhaps arguably a fairly standard model of industry custom and practice. And it is clear when you look at all of these events in the round, it is clear that extensive change needed within the industry, and we should all think very carefully about our own specific roles and how we might be contributing to similar risks in other projects. I'll now hand over to Dr. Hywel Davies to undertake the second part of this presentation.
In particular, the cladding and the insulation products that were used on Grenfell. The products had gone through a number of tests. They had been tested to BS 476 Part 7, but both the nature of those tests and what those tests really indicated was not well understood. Richard has already commented on the failings of a number of those involved in the project to read building regulations, to read the approved documents, the statutory guidance that supports them. And there was also, there were two failures. One failure was to ask appropriate questions, and the other was to understand the meaning of some of the test results. So products were supposedly tested to class 0 and to BS 8414, but those involved in the design and the construction, I think it's fair to say, did not understand what those test results meant. And there were various desktop studies involved that were not properly scrutinised. But the inquiry found that worse than all of those project-specific failings, the fire test methods available did not provide designers with the information needed to assess the risk of fire spreading across the external wall of a building. And it's fair to say that some of the testing that was carried out to support phase 2 of the inquiry indicated the extent to which it was not possible to rely on some of those test results in design activity. There was also a real problem with the way that the product manufacturers were behaving. And that was particularly evident in different ways for each of the three manufacturers. Kingspan were found by the inquiry to have knowingly created a false market in insulation for use on buildings over 18 metres by claiming that its product was successfully used elsewhere. But more than that, they had used a certificate from 2005, which was a decade before the refurbishment, based on a successful BS 8414 test, but based on a successful test using the composition of the insulation product as it was in 2005. And they did not have a successful test on the composition as it was changed in 2006. Indeed, it failed BS 8414 tests, but the successful BS 8414 test was used as a basis for Kingspan to obtain certification both from the BBA and from LABC, and to continue to sell the product for a number of years. They did finally withdraw that certificate during the inquiry, during the phase 2 module where they were giving evidence. The inquiry did say that Kingspan was not directly responsible for the fire, but that their disregard for fire safety in its marketing displayed deeply entrenched and persistent dishonesty in pursuit of commercial gain, to quote the inquiry report. Kingspan were not alone, and it is worth noting that Kingspan's product would not have been used on Grenfell Tower had there not been a shortage of the Celotex product that was specified and was being used. But the Celotex product was also non-compliant and shouldn't have been in use on a building of that height. And Celotex had indulged in other activities to gain certification, partly motivated by the thought that, well, Kingspan have got it, there must be a way, without realizing that that way wasn't appropriate. And the Celotex tests were subject to modifications of the test rig in ways that took the test outside the scope of 8414. So both Celotex and Kingspan had obtained certificates in inappropriate ways. And finally, Arconic, they had tests on their product in 2005, which revealed a devastating fire performance when the product was used in the cassette shape, whereby it was bent in order to enable the cladding units to be hung on railings rather than being bolted to the building. And this information was withheld from BBA, and indeed there were emails within Arconic advising members of staff to treat this material as this information as highly confidential. So Arconic knew exactly what would happen to the product in certain configurations, and they kept that secret. So all three manufacturers were heavily criticised by the inquiry, and one of the phrases used was systematic dishonesty, referring to all three of them. And there we have the statement from the inquiry that Arconic deliberately concealed from the market the true extent of the danger of using the Renabond 55PE product in cassette form, particularly on high-rise buildings. They had known and they kept quiet. I've talked a little bit about Celotex and what the inquiry described as a rigged safety test, where they used non-combustible magnesium oxide boards on the rig. And not only were those boards not mentioned in the test certificate, but there is a record in the evidence of Celotex asking for photographs to be amended so as not to display the magnesium oxide boards. And there's a question as to how on earth those boards could be fitted to the test rig and the test conducted without somebody observing them and saying, excuse me, but they're not meant to be on this test rig. Why are they here? And on the back of that test, Celotex were then able to market the product as being acceptable for use in buildings above 18 metres in height. The report believes that their claim was based on the manipulation of evidence with the complicity of BRE. That is what the report says. BRE is criticised, and you will have the slides later, so I won't go through this in detail, but poor supervision of the testing, and they're also criticised for a failure to make government aware of things that they knew when they were certainly at the time of the fire widely regarded as a leading expert body on fire safety. And they are criticised in the report quite firmly for their failings over a period, I'm afraid to say, of decades. Marred by unprofessional conduct, inadequate practices, a lack of effective oversight, poor reporting, and a lack of scientific rigour. And there was a concern that the BRE was open to manipulation by unscrupulous product manufacturers. There was also a compromise in that whilst BRE staff were undertaking tests, they were also giving advice. And the inquiry is very critical of this. And it's an issue that has also been picked up by Paul Morell and Annalise Day in their independent review of testing and certification. Test bodies should test, and they should not be giving advice on how to pass the test. The BBA is criticised as well for lack of robust processes at the time, failure to enforce the terms of its contract, and ultimately for issuing a materially incorrect certificate. LABC ran a private, non-UCAS approved certification scheme for construction products, and they are criticised for inadequate expertise. They engaged a senior building control officer in a local authority who, it has to be said, did express concerns about his own level of knowledge and capability to undertake the role, and was assured that he would receive support from LABC. The relevant chapter of the report indicates that he did not receive the promised support, and that the LABC process resulted in a certificate that was based on inaccurate, inappropriate information and should not have been issued. The Both the BBA's scrutiny of fire performance was seriously deficient, and it led to misleading certificates. And that in turn was then used by LABC, and I'm afraid that compounded the issues. So there was really a fairly significant failing in the testing and certification arrangements, and that the manufacturers were able to obtain inappropriate certificates because the testing and certification bodies did not do due diligence on the statements in product certificates. They did not go back and ask, where is the test evidence in detail? And I'm sure in the future we're going to see debates about this, particularly around access to test evidence. And manufacturers will say, well, there's a lot of proprietary information in here, but I really don't see how they can avoid the conclusion that if they claim that product X passes test Y, they've got to provide the evidence that that product really has passed test Y, and that that test was undertaken in a properly approved and competent and accredited test laboratory. And if they can't provide that evidence, I don't see how they can claim to comply with the test standards. But that will doubtless be debated further. UCAS does not escape criticism, and again, there is a concern that because UCAS is dependent on selling its services to test houses, it has a conflict of interest when it comes to selling its services and enforcing the rules. And the inquiry criticises it for failing to act decisively. Finally, failures in regulation. There were failures around fire risk assessments, which I think Richard has already spoken to, and the work of the fire risk assessor was inadequate, and indeed the inquiry finds that he had misrepresented his qualifications to undertake the work. It seems that that may be investigated further. The government was found to have consistently resisted calls from across the sector to regulate fire risk assessors. That has now come through in the inquiry recommendation to that effect. And central government was guilty of failings that frankly go back 40 years. Various fatal cladding fires, Garnet Court, Lakanal House, should have been seen as red flags, but weren't. In the case of Lakanal House, in spite of a coroner raising concerns with government. And the inquiry concludes that the fire was the culmination of decades of failure by central government and other bodies in positions of responsibility in the construction industry to look carefully into the danger of incorporating combustible materials into the external walls of high-rise residential buildings and to act on the information available to them. And the inquiry also stated quite clearly that approved document B was unclear, not properly understood by a significant proportion of those working in the construction industry. And if I can add an observation, I think we also have an issue that many in the industry do not understand the difference between the requirements in Schedule 1 of the building regulations, Part B, the functional requirements to make appropriate provision for means of escape, for example, in B1, and the statutory guidance that is contained in the approved documents. And I suspect there is work to be done there. Government should have been aware by 2016 that combustible insulation and ACM panels were routinely being used on high-rise buildings in a way that they shouldn't have been. They did not comply with functional requirement B4, and the inquiry criticises government for failure to amend the guidance in approved document B. We're going to take a pause now for a few minutes, and I'm conscious that we've overrun slightly. I'm going to suggest that we take a 10-minute break and try to return at 11:32.
Yeah, let's do 11:35 for simplicity.
11:35.
Can I just make a couple of points? Firstly, please do use the www.sli.do address and number at the bottom of the screen to get online and submit questions. I realise that many will have followed the inquiry report with great interest. So some of this will be familiar, but I'd also ask people to reflect um, on the extensive nature and comprehensive nature of the industry failings that the inquiry highlights. We will look at a summary of those key findings, or at least some of the key takeaways that we believe are most relevant at the beginning of the next session. But nonetheless, uh, there are implications for every single part of the construction and professional services industries serving the built environment. Uh, we are absolutely beholden to learn all of the lessons that devolve from these events to ensure that they don't happen again. And anyone, I think, who believes that there aren't lessons for them may well be um, mistaken. So take a little bit of time to think. A short break, 10 minutes. We'll reconvene and restart at 11:35 and look at some of those key findings. Thank you very much. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, everyone's back in the virtual room. Welcome to session two, which is going to look at the recommendations primarily flowing from phase two of the Grenfell report. Please, as I said before, use the details in the chat or at the bottom of the slide to get on board with the Slido and ask some questions. I can see some questions coming through, which is really great, but please do bring those forward so that we can answer them in the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the phase two report very briefly. It was published on the 4th September 2024. It's more than 1,700 pages long. It makes 58 recommendations specifically. 26 relate to construction and buildings. We're going to focus on those in the session today. 2 relate to residents. We will touch on those as they remain critical, and we must never forget that the focus of all that we're talking about here is keeping people safe. But 26 relate to firefighting and the fire service, and we won't be covering those today, primarily because they are somewhat out of scope for our membership, but because we need to focus more on the first 26. The government's committed to responding to the public inquiry within 6 months, so that would be by March the 4th, 2025 at the latest. We know that there have been lots of discussions between various industry groups and government on how to take the recommendations forward. What we can say is that we should expect further change to the regulatory and legal requirements imposed on construction in England and potentially Wales from further legislative interventions. Those inevitably have knock-on effects in other jurisdictions as well. The Scottish Government has a working group that is also reviewing the Grenfell Phase 2 findings and implications for building standards in Scotland. And we know that this is also being looked at further afield as well. So that said, let's move on to talk about some of the key findings, and then we'll move on and Hal will take us through the specific recommendations from the inquiry report. Next slide, please. So, what have we learned? What should we understand? Firstly, prioritization of economic growth over compliance by successive governments led to a weak system. without sufficient resource or enforcement, both at a central government level and at a local government level. I think that's extremely relevant given where we are in the economic cycle. There are justifiable arguments for not including building regulations in consideration of wider deregulation in the future, which must be given heed to. Competition weakened the position of building control bodies as regulators, and that worked in both directions within the public and private sector. Guidance issued by government was unclear and misunderstood. A process, you might argue, of progressive salami slicing, of progressive gaming or marginalisation of requirements. But however we got to the position we did in 2017, the industry did not understand its expectations and responsibilities, even though they were implicit in law. There's a failure by government to respond to warning signs, and that must change. And the standards and systems were purposely subverted. The legislation, powers, and role of central government departments were unfit for purpose and inadequate to control industry appetite for risk and the risks that were emerging. Critically, there was also an over-reliance on historical evidence as a predictor of current or future risk. And I think this is one area where both government and industry are going to have to work very hard to actually reintegrate risk management skills into the construction process. We had a very much compliance focused process. Have you met a series of tick box minimum requirements that have become accepted, rather than actually looking at the risks that we were looking to manage through those functional requirements. Next slide, please. In terms of professionals, there were large gaps in technical competence, lacking at too many levels. Again, this is a decade-long process of marginalisation, of roles, of lack of support for education, training, and a general squeeze on resources to maintain and develop competence in order to deliver buildings at lower cost. While the professional competence of many who were involved was questionable, but no one checked whether they were competent. There was no process or even thought of asking the question, are you actually able to do this job? There is a failure of too many people within the overall supply chain, which is prevalent across the industry, of people understanding the criticality of working within limits of competence. The ability to identify boundaries of competence and then push back against being asked to exceed those limits of competence is the foundation stone of professional ethics and behavior. And again, commercial pressures have overwhelmed too many people, individuals and organizations, in terms of pushing them to take on work that they lack the competence to do, and an unwillingness to push back when asked to do so by clients. There was a fundamental lack of accountability. People did not understand the boundaries of their responsibility and the responsibility of others. Everyone seemed willing to believe that someone else was responsible for checking compliance and fire safety. But in general, the whole system had become transactional to the extent whereby as long as you could get paid, then it seems, that was the sole aim, ultimately at the end of the day. Over-reliance on building control to understand and assure compliance. So the industry's understanding and ability to work within the regulatory system had become hollowed out and reliant on building control to solve problems and point out changes needed to achieve compliance rather than taking responsibility for compliance themselves. There's a failure to be willing to raise risks with clients. There's a complete lack of systems thinking and capability. So no one was taking a holistic overview of the system performance or fire safety, or safety of the building. And there are concerns about the performance of some professional bodies in terms of holding their members to account. Next slide, please. In terms of procurement and construction, there was a client unwillingness to provide adequate time and resource to undertake the work, which is now written as a fundamental into the requirements of the duty holding regime. Flawed design and build model of procurement. Um, it is possible to argue that design and build can work well, and there are almost certainly projects where that's the case. But in the worst case scenarios, design and build has moved to a model where quality control and management are arguably absent or defective. Approaches to procurement that prioritize lowest cost have been clearly identified as to the detriment of both compliance and safety. Contractual systems that increase risk by encouraging adversarial, risk-averse behaviors and which disincentivize transparency and collaboration are a significant contributor to the unwillingness of parties to communicate risk or share risk or allocate or assume responsibilities. A huge over-reliance on what proved to be an incompetent subcontractor design supply chain, far from unique to Grenfell. Subcontractor design processes remain somewhat clouded in mystery and are an area where further thinking is definitely needed. Mismanaged value engineering, leading to inappropriate product substitution, and again, poor or absent control of installation quality on site. Next slide, please. In terms of construction products, absolutely fundamental questions to answer here. The construction product manufacturing, testing, certification, marketing specification, and provision of information that we have worked with historically has been proven to be deeply flawed. Oversight of and quality of accreditation, testing, and certification has been indicated to have been overly compromised by commercial interests over time and arguably unfit for purpose. Persistent and targeted dishonesty and misrepresentation by manufacturers and distributors further exacerbated the weaknesses within that system. And within the industry itself, the building and professional services industry, there's a very clear lack of understanding as to what test methods and results meant, how those results should be understood, and where products were suitable for use. Construction products and testing is now probably one of the highest priority areas for resolution, and something that we, as an association, think is incredibly important. Next slide, please. Finally, fire safety. It is impossible to overstate the conclusion as to the criticality of compartmentation within all building projects. If there is one area that we as an industry, both at a professional and at a trade and contracting level, have within our direct control, it is the ability to get compartmentation right. And it is quite clear that that requires attention from the macro level in terms of systems performance, right down to all of the small but incredibly important details at interfaces, at penetrations within a building project, at both design, specification, and then installation phase. This is something we have to get right, and it must be, again, a priority for everyone to be reviewing how they do that, because if the compartmentation fails, then most of the other underlying solutions also are called into question. We need to understand that geometry has an important role to play in changing the intensity and rate of fire spread. We need to be very mindful of the critical role of smoke control systems and the potential for those systems to be overwhelmed, and the consequences of smoke control systems being overwhelmed, particularly where compartmentation has failed. The need for consistent and ongoing maintenance and rapid response to identified defects. The need for greater consideration of escape for vulnerable people in the event of fire, and also the value of additional levels of mitigation beyond the minimum required. As time progresses and as buildings and systems age, those additional levels of mitigation become increasingly important. Next slide, please. Now, just one thing to note, before I hand over to Hal to go through the inquiry recommendations, CABE, in collaboration with the Engineering Council, has worked to develop an competence assessment scheme for its members and for others wishing to demonstrate their competence to work on higher risk buildings. We have our higher risk building registration scheme, which is open to people at a technician, incorporated engineer, and chartered engineer level. It's a robust attestation of people's experience and competence to work on higher risk buildings. And I would encourage everyone to think about that as a way of being able to demonstrate their legal compliance, but also as a way of identifying the skills and knowledge that they need to work within their limits of competence. And I'm now going to hand over to Hal. Next slide, please, to take us through the specific recommendations of the report.
Thank you very much, Richard. Before I get into the detail, I do just want to make one quick comment, partly in response to something I've seen on Slido. I don't want to preempt the questions, but I think it's very important to say that what we're dealing with here are the recommendations of a formal public inquiry held under the Public Inquiries Act 2005, and a public inquiry is established in order to find out what happened, and the inquiry has made a number of observations on the contribution of various parties, and we've gone through them. And I think you may have noticed that we've been careful to quote the words of the inquiry report verbatim at a number of points, so that we are reporting what the inquiry has found and has reported. But it's important to be aware that this is a public inquiry. It's not a criminal investigation. The inquiry received around 1 million documents, of which the team considered about 300,000 were of significant interest to the inquiry. And all of that material, as well as the report, has been passed over to the Metropolitan Police. It's my understanding that much of the evidence the inquiry received was shared with the Metropolitan Police as the inquiry progressed. And the Metropolitan Police is now looking carefully at what it's been passed, and is reported to have the largest criminal inquiry in its history running. There have been no prosecutions, but the Metropolitan Police have been clear that we will not know about any potential prosecutions until sometime probably later next year. So we have the inquiry recommendations. The Metropolitan Police inquiries are ongoing, and they should be allowed to continue, and they will be, there will be further indications of what that will lead to in due course, and it's not something that we should be speculating on. So I hope that provides a little bit of helpful clarity on where we are in that respect. So if I could have the next slide, please. One of the biggest recommendations is for a single regulator, which would have much wider powers than either the Building Safety Regulator or the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And the recommendation is that the work of both the BSR and the OPSS is brought together into one single regulator referred to as the Construction Regulator. And that would cover products, so it would cover the regulation of construction products. It would oversee the development of test methods. It would oversee the testing and certification of such products and the issue of certificates. Now, there are some significant things there, and I'll make a couple of comments on potential implications in a minute. They would also be responsible for the regulation and oversight of building control. It's recommended that they would license contractors to work on higher risk buildings. They would, of course, be the building control authority on higher risk buildings. They would monitor the operation of the building regulations, and of the statutory guidance, and would advise the Secretary of State on the need for changes to statutory guidance, and they would be responsible for carrying out research. And they would also collect information, exchange information with other bodies such as Fire and Rescue, possibly the Regulator for Social Housing, and they would be responsible for accrediting fire risk assessors and potentially for the registration of fire engineers, which is another recommendation. Now, a couple of quick comments, because this is quite a substantive body that goes well beyond anything we already have. Some of these proposals would need to be looked at very carefully, because we already have a national body that deals with testing. It's called the British Standards Institution, and it has a formal memorandum of understanding with government. So, it's not clear how this recommendation would interact with that. Testing and certification of products is currently undertaken in the private sector. We don't have a government laboratory that does that in this country. In Europe, where the construction products regulation has just been revised and the new regulation was published shortly before Christmas, for the benefit of those short of Christmas reading, the European system relies on a system of notified bodies for testing and certification. And to be a notified body in Europe, you have to be based in Europe. So this regulator, if it were to take on testing and certification of products, would almost certainly not be a notified body under the construction products regulation. And I, at the moment, cannot see how that would lead to anything other than a significant divergence of the construction products regime in the UK from that in Europe. That, of course, then raises the question, what about Northern Ireland, which I'll raise and then move on from because it's too difficult. There are some really big ramifications here, and government will have to weigh all of these things and more in deciding what to do in its response. Just to remind ourselves, the inquiry report came out on the 4th of September, and the Prime Minister committed then that the government would respond within 6 months. That takes us to Tuesday, the 4th of March, which is not very long away. And at that point, we would expect government to be saying something. I don't think they will have all the answers, but they will need to give us an idea of where they're going. Could I have the next slide, please? There is a recommendation which recommends that the definition of higher risk building for the purposes of the Building Safety Act should be reviewed. Now, it's really important to stress that this recommendation is expressly in the context of evacuating those who are termed vulnerable people by the report. And I think, to be clear, this means people who would struggle to evacuate using the stairs, and that may be by reason of disability, it may be by reason of age, it may be because of other protected characteristics such as pregnancy or being the parent of a very young child who can't use stairs. All of these people need to get out in the event of a fire or other emergency, and it was noted by the inquiry that 40% of those who were unable to use the stairs at Grenfell Tower died on the morning of the 15th of June. So it was a real tragedy, and those people were disproportionately affected. It is in that context that this recommendation is made. It's worth noting that this would require a change to the Building Safety Act itself, because the 18 metres or 7 or more stories is written into the Act. It's not in the regulations. It's also worth noting that buildings below 18 metres in which people live are still covered by fire safety legislation. They still come under the fire safety order. Those responsible for them are still responsible for making sure that people can escape in the case of an emergency. That is already the case today without any change to the definition. And it's also worth saying that a huge amount of work was done in the preparation for the Building Safety Act. Some who've been watching this over the years will recall that Dame Judith originally started by referring to high-rise residential buildings and defined them as 30 metres or over 10 stories. That was brought down to the 18 metres, 7 or more stories, for a variety of reasons. And there was pressure to bring it down to 11 metres or 5 stories or more. But there are roughly 12,500 of what we now know as HRBs. There are 85 to 90,000 buildings that are over 11 metres and residential. And the implications of changing the definition of HRBs to expand the population of HRBs and therefore expand the requirements to manage them are significant. And again, government will need to think very carefully about that, and they may need to balance whether there is sufficient existing legislation that needs to be applied and enforced more significantly, or whether there needs to be a change. Again, we will have to wait and see. Could I have the next slide, please? There is a recommendation that all responsibility for fire and building safety and product testing should be brought together in one department. That has been done before. We've had multiple departments, we've had single departments. Government will have to take a view on what it wants to do on that. And there may be benefits to a single body, a single department. It's also worth bearing in mind that government interacts with construction in 3 distinct ways. First, as the safety regulator, and indeed as the construction products regulator, but it also interacts with government as the sponsor of the industry, as government has an interest in construction performing and contributing to the economy. It accounts for 8 to 10% of GDP, and if some government ambitions for growth are going to be achieved, home building, then it's going to need to work with the construction sector for that. And then thirdly, government is the single biggest client of construction. So those are 3 distinct things, and whether they should all be brought together in one department or continue to operate separately are all things that ministers will, I'm sure, be being thoughtful about and seeking the advice of civil servants as we speak. And again, we shall have to wait and see. Next slide, please. There is a recommendation for a chief construction advisor with a sufficient budget and staff to provide advice on matters affecting the construction industry. Now, I need to make a personal declaration of interest here. I was the last chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, which brought together about 15 or 16 industry experts, and we met on a regular basis, and we provided advice on matters affecting building regulations and statutory guidance. The previous government decided to abolish BRAC, which was established under the old Building Act. And I have to say that those with long memories may recall both Paul Morell and Peter Hansford being Chief Construction Advisor between 2009 and 2015. They undertook a different role to what is being proposed here. They were much more involved in industry sponsorship, although I think Paul Morell played a critical role in restraining some of the deregulatory tendencies of the Chancellor in 2011. But this role is very different. It is much more like bringing somebody in with staff support to do a number of the things that BRAC used to do. That has been put to government by others than me, and again, we will have to see what government decides to do. Next slide, please. The inquiry found that legislation and indeed statutory guidance was unclear. Understanding of the legislation in the industry is very poor. I say is very poor. I think for those following the current debates about BS 9991, you will be familiar with the confusion between what is required by the functional requirements, what is statutory guidance in approved document B or other approved documents, what is industry good practice as set out in standards. The inquiry has recommended clearly that approved document B needs revision, and indeed government had already moved to act on that even before the inquiry report was published. They've also recommended that some key text is inserted in each section of the statutory guidance around the legal requirements, and to make it very clear that compliance with the statutory guidance will not necessarily result in compliance with them. One of the things that people working on HRBs and applying for approval of plans for HRBs are getting to grips with is the new regime in which the applicants need to demonstrate why they believe that their proposals are compliant with the building regulations, and that includes setting out why they have followed particular guidance and why they think that following that guidance leads them to a compliant solution that satisfies the functional requirement. This is part of the change that we're going through. And it's not just HRBs, that there is now an expectation that those submitting applications to building inspectors understand for themselves why what they're submitting is compliant and can explain why they think it's compliant. It's not the inspector's job to do that. The inspector is there to determine whether they agree with the submission being compliant, not to determine whether they think it's compliant for the applicant. So we're seeing some of these changes. Approved document B is under review, and the Deputy Prime Minister announced back in December that there is going to be a fundamental review of the approved documents. And I understand that work on that is ongoing, and we will doubtless be hearing more about that, possibly starting with government's response to the inquiry. Next slide, please. There is an explicit provision that a registered fire engineer should provide a fire safety strategy to go along with building control applications at Gateway 2 for higher risk buildings, and an expectation that it is reviewed and updated and throughout the process and resubmitted at the stage of completion. That strategy needs to take into account the needs of vulnerable people, those who can't use the stairs, and needs to consider that they may need additional time to leave the building or reach a place of safety. Now, this goes hand in hand with the recommendation to register fire engineers. So those who practice as fire engineers would be required to be registered, and then you would need to use one of those people who is registered to produce your fire safety strategy. Now, this in part is already perhaps part of the process around Gateway 2, although not the registration of fire engineers and not the statutory protection of that role, but part of the process is there. Again, we're going to need to see what government does. This does have significant implications for professional bodies because the inquiry recommendation is to establish a wholly new body to register fire engineers and not to work through an existing body. Now, whether that is the most appropriate way to do it or not will doubtless be considered by government. It's very clear that the inquiry felt strongly that it needed a new body and was not something to allocate to an existing body. And we will have to see what government makes of that in its response. But what is very clear is that there will need to be a greater focus on fire safety strategy. Next slide, please. Fire performance tests. Now, I touched on this earlier in talking about construction products. The inquiry is recommending that professionals and the academic community are brought in to develop new test methods. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn if I say that I'm aware that the British Standards Institution is already thinking about this and thinking about how it addresses test method development going forward and how it reviews BS 8414 and the use of BS 9414 for desktop studies. That is being thought about, but government may wish to say more on that in its response. And I touched on the issue of test results, and the recommendation of the inquiry is very clear that all test results supporting a certificate issued by the construction regulator should be included in the certificate for that product, and that manufacturers should be required to provide the regulator with the full testing history of the product. Now, I think it's important to ask, when does research and development become specific product development? And is this really suggesting that manufacturers will have to open the books on all of their R&D? I think that needs to be taken very carefully, because I imagine that multinationals with facilities in the UK and other countries might decide to move their R&D outside the UK if that is taken too far. But I'm equally absolutely certain that if a manufacturer wants to claim my product complies with test X, they've got to provide the evidence in full that their product does really comply with test X. And there is a suggestion by the inquiry, a recommendation, that manufacturers be required to provide by law copies of all test results that support claims about fire performance for products. Again, we will see what the government decides to do about that. Next slide, please. I've touched on fire engineers, and the inquiry is quite clear that the profession of fire engineer be recognised and protected by law, and that an independent body be established to regulate the profession, define standards for membership and maintain a register of members and regulate their conduct. I'm not going to pass comment on it, but it has been confirmed that that is a recommendation for a new body and not to give this responsibility to an existing body. And that would need to cover education and training. There is a lack of high quality master's level training in fire engineering in this country. Indeed, recently we've seen one course in this area closed down. And we've touched on the standards piece and the involvement of academic fire engineers and practitioners, and also that government looks further at the training and professional formation of fire engineers. So some significant implications here, and we will have to see what government has to say. I do think that, and I've said this in other fora, this is a wake-up call for the professional bodies, because what is clearly not being stated here is that the existing framework should be used for the registration of fire engineers. And if it's not used for fire engineers, where could that stop? So the professional bodies do need to look hard at this, and we need to see, and we need to demonstrate to government, those of us that are taking this very seriously, we need to demonstrate that to government very clearly, and we need to continue to take it seriously with the support and active participation of our members. Next slide, please. There are recommendations around architects. Architects are already subject to protected title, and you can only practice as an architect if you're registered with the ARB. There is a professional body, but you don't have to belong to it to be registered as an architect. But there are concerns that there is more to be done with architects, and there is a recommendation that where an architect is acting as a principal designer, a senior manager within that practice should be signing off applications at Gateway 2. Again, to demonstrate that the practice believes it has taken all reasonable steps to ensure that the design that they are submitting, if built and completed, will be compliant with building regulations. Next slide, please. There is a proposal for licensing of contractors working on higher risk buildings. And I think we can see why if we listened to what Richard had to say earlier about those involved in the delivery of that project. Richard made a comment about the failings of design and build. I have heard people from the Building Safety Regulator when asked, well, does this mean we can't use design and build? And they say, not entirely flippantly, no, there's no problem with design and build. You design it, you get the design approved, and then you build the approved design. What's the problem? Well, we all know the problem is that's not what design and build means. And the inquiry was very critical of that. So we will have to see what government decides to do about licensing those building HRBs, and indeed what they might do about controls elsewhere in the sector. Next slide, please. Now, I'm acutely aware that the building control sector has already had rapid and extensive, and I think for many traumatic reform. The inquiry recommends that more may need to be done, and the two recommendations are quoted on the slide, that the government appoint an independent panel to consider whether it's in the public interest for building control functions to be performed by those who have a commercial interest in the process, and that the same panel consider whether all building control functions should be performed by a national authority. Now, we don't know what government is going to do on this, but I think at this point I would like to say that a number of people have made it very clear to government officials that the worst possible thing for the building control sector is a further period of uncertainty, waiting for more change. That's been made very clear to government. There may need to be further changes to the building control system, but they need to be very carefully thought through, and they need to take account of the fact that we have already seen significant attrition in building control over the last 2 or 3 years, and we quite simply can't afford to push more people out of the profession without exceedingly good reasons. And those points have been made at high levels to government, and we will see what they come up with. But I think there is an awareness, there is certainly an awareness at the Building Safety Regulator that this needs to be handled very carefully. Next slide, please. The inquiry recommended a construction library, particularly around cladding materials, drawing on the model of the University of Queensland. I think it's fair to say that there has been some thought about how that would apply in the UK. Should it be limited to cladding materials? Are there other things that should be made available? And are there other aspects? Again, we will need to see what the government says in its response. And this is the sort of thing where undoubtedly there is likely to be consultation and further discussion, and the association will be taking a close interest and participating in that fully if it goes ahead. Next slide, please. I've already said that. No, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Another inquiry recommendation was around how government responds to recommendations from inquiries. And one of the frustrations for the inquiry is that lessons learned, particularly at Lakanal House, but at other buildings where problems had emerged over the preceding 2.5 decades, that those lessons hadn't been learned. There was a particular criticism of the response to the Lakanal House coroner's report. And so the public inquiry recommended that it be made a legal requirement for the government to maintain a publicly accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, coroners, and public inquiries, together with a description of the steps taken in response. If the government decides not to accept a recommendation, it should record its reasons, perhaps for not doing so. And scrutiny of its actions should be a matter of Parliament. Again, we'll see what happens on this. My personal opinion is that if the taxpayer has funded an expensive public inquiry, and the Grenfell Tower inquiry cost £200 million or so, then the very least that the taxpayer who funded it should get is some feedback from government on what it's doing with the recommendations that have been made. But again, government will consider and decide, and we'll hear in due course. Next slide, please. Richard has already mentioned the recommendation around registering fire risk assessors as well as fire engineers, and the recommendation that government has a system for that. Again, this is heavily influenced by the criticisms of the fire risk assessor at Grenfell. And then there were two other recommendations, one around fire control switches in lifts, and government, the Building Safety Regulator and the National Fire Chiefs Council have already done some work on this. This was around standard keys to fire control switches. The key that the firefighter who first tried to take control of the lift at Grenfell used did not work, and there were problems with the drop switch. I think it's also worth noting that when the inquiry looked in detail at the records of lift maintenance, and they questioned at least one of the maintenance personnel, the maintenance personnel were convinced that they had done things on that lift when they visited it, and the CCTV footage shows that they clearly did not do those things. So there are some interesting lessons there around not just lifts and maintenance, but all forms of maintenance. How do we make sure that what is meant to be done really is done, and that what has been done is recorded, other than by CCTV? There's also a moral, perhaps responsible persons might want to use the CCTV to check that things have been done if they have suspicions. And then there's the issue of the pipeline isolation valves, which had been buried and made it very difficult to turn off the gas supply to Grenfell. And again, that prompted a recommendation to the gas transporters. Next slide, please. There were two recommendations in the Phase 1 report around those who could not evacuate using the stairs. And this touched on the fact that the 72 who died at Grenfell, all of those deaths were avoidable. That was the finding of the inquiry. And they made comments on trust in the industry and on those who manage the built environment, which I think, if we're reasonable, none of us would wish to argue. They also made the observation that 40% of those unable to use the stairs died. And their recommendations about how we get people out of buildings if they can't use stairs, they did not feel that the Phase 1 recommendations had been adequately addressed, and they restated them in the Phase 2 report. Government has now made proposals around personal emergency evacuation plans. And that work is ongoing, but I think there is still work to be done in that area. And whilst I'm sure we all recognise that those who survived, those who were bereaved, former residents of Grenfell, they have all, their lives have been changed forever by what happened. But so have many others, and that's not in any way to downplay the suffering of the bereaved survivors and relatives. It's estimated that some 4.2 million people, which is 8% of the population, I believe, have in some way been affected by the failings of the construction sector and of the system in their buildings, leading to non-compliant buildings with inappropriate cladding materials, with inadequate fire safety measures, and all the things that we know about. Their lives have been severely affected as well. There are some people living in properties who still cannot sell them because of failings of building work on that building, with all the trauma that goes with that. And again, the inquiry was clear that government should be taking account of that. Next slide, please. Enough from me and from Richard. I know we have a number of questions coming in already, and Richard is now going to lead us through them, and we're going to attempt to answer them where we think we can.
Yeah, if you want to turn your camera on, Hal, we will start to work through these. So thank you to everyone who has submitted questions through Slido. I just want to kind of reflect very briefly on that last slide. The Phase 2 report focuses very much on the industry's failings and not necessarily on the direct impacts. But I think we have to accept that the failings are so pervasive and widespread that there is a need for a progressive period of re-evaluation and change. And we've all been going through that for quite some time. We've all been aware of the potential for change and then the changes enacted through the Building Safety Act. But what I hope this presentation has done today has reinforced the need for everyone to positively engage with what further change is needed. The government and residents and society quite rightly expect us to continue to change until we get this right. And so our focus as an association is on supporting and delivering against those changes. But there is also a duty for everyone else to think carefully, regardless of whether they're HRBs or other types of buildings, about these issues and how we actually improve and get it right. So I'm going to go through the questions largely on the basis of the upvoting that's happened on Slido. So if you want to see a question answered on Slido, if you like it, it will get a vote. The questions with the most votes go to the top, so I'm going to largely follow those. And the first question comes from Robert Gary. Good afternoon, Robert. Very good to hear from you. Is the construction industry buying into the regulatory changes? What evidence exists of behavioural change or better understanding of competence and compliance? I'm going to start that out by saying, look, when we talk about the industry as a whole, it is really difficult to make generalizations about who is doing what and how well things are going. In every sector, there are people who are aggressively buying into the need to change and are driving things forward, but there are also people still waiting to see what should happen, what will happen, whether they will find direct drivers or requirements to change in their day-to-day lives, and others who are either unaware or unengaged or simply, and they are a minority, they're a small minority, or who simply don't think that this is relevant to them. What I see from my position is that the structures needed for industry to change are rapidly evolving, particularly in terms of competence, through the work of committees like the Industry Competence Steering Group, where there is a huge effort to map out the entirety of the range of competencies needed within the industry and to put the frameworks and assessment methods in place for all of the people in the industry to work within a system that assesses competence, and clearly that competence will mandate the need to demonstrate an understanding of how to deliver legal compliance and regulatory and technical compliance. Assessment systems are coming forward and being rolled out. I've talked about our higher risk building safety register, but other systems and accreditations are becoming available. What follows on from that is the need to manage competence over time, and that's going to take a bit longer for industry to move to that model. Organizations and businesses, we see the best of those have already shifted the way that they manage and check the competence of those within their organizations and their supply chains. But further down the supply chain and into the smaller businesses, there's a huge amount of work to be done to ensure that those businesses are aware of and understand how to comply and how to demonstrate compliance. So there's a great deal of work to do there. And then we do need to see, probably in the medium term, much more extensive adoption of third-party oversight and checking to actually maintain the standards that are needed. So is the industry changing? I think there are a lot of people in industry who have changed. I think there are a lot of people who want to know that they are doing the right thing, but maybe don't know quite how to yet. So we are very much on a longer term journey. Clearly, enforcement action from the safety regulator and from building control bodies will help, given the enhanced enforcement powers and the wider remit against which they can enforce over time. That will drive change further. But if you're here talking about these issues, thinking about these issues, then our advice is very much to make the change before it's demanded of you. And there are various different ways that that can be affected. But Hal, what's your view as to the state of play in effect?
Um, I mean, I think I broadly agree with you, Richard. I think there are people who are trying to do the right things. I think there are people trying to do the right things and finding it frustrating that others aren't. There are lots of reports about how long it's taking to get things through Gateway 2. And I am sure, and I don't think anybody in the regulator would mind me saying that they are implementing a new regime and they are learning how it works too. But I think they're very frustrated. There was a Freedom of Information request that led to the publication of some numbers a week ago on Friday. There have been over 1,600 applications for approval of full plans at Gateway 2. Over 400 of them have been sent back as invalid. And the reason for that is very specific. The first thing the regulator does is to assess whether they have got all of the information that the higher risk buildings procedures regs require. 1 in 4 is not coming in complete. Now, I really struggle to understand how that can be. These regulations have been around for very nearly 18, well, they've been around for 18 months, they've been enforced for 16 months. What is so hard to do? Why are so many of them inadequate? Now, I'm not suggesting that every single one of them is because people are stubbornly refusing to it, but there's clearly a long way to go. And I'd like to think that some senior people in the industry are saying, this simply cannot be efficient. We can't, we don't want to be bearing the costs of putting things in, having them checked, and being charged for having them checked and then sent back. You could do your own checks. So it's a very variable, and this is at the HRB end. What's going on down at the bottom of the industry with the white van and 1 or 2 people in a small business? Have they all heard of the Building Safety Act?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, isn't it? Kind of penetrating down into that. When you think there are 293,000 businesses in the construction sector permeating this change, and the complexity of the change, it's conceptually not that easy to understand some of the duty holding requirements. Procedurally, it's quite complex. Getting that through into the supply chain as a whole is a massive challenge. But I think, we all have a duty to provide leadership at whatever level we are acting within the industry. And that has to be about saying, right, this is the new reality. We need to get on top of it. We need to deal with it. Hiding from it, pushing it away, hoping that it doesn't take effect. This is not the way to go. So uh, as always, we just encourage people to get into the detail, utilize the resources that are out. There's a huge amount of information out there as to what to do. Perhaps a bit more industry consensus around the answers is needed to help people have confidence. But there is no doubt that we're going to see more change as well. Um, but we've got to get a grip with that, and hopefully, this is a very long-term process. It's not an overnight process of change, but people do need to move, and they need to move because it's the right thing to do. But also, if they wish to be protected in terms of being able to demonstrate that they meet their legal obligations, then everyone needs to change the way that they behave and think about how they manage competence and safety in the work that they do. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which is from Julian Jones. Good afternoon, Julian. Are there active talks going on within government about bringing building control under one government body to abolish the private and local authority sectors to build resilience? Well, we've seen that this is one of the recommendations from the public inquiry. The simple answer is that we do not know what discussions are going on around this particular recommendation within government. The government and the building safety regulator have both been, I think it's fair to say, playing their cards very close to their chest with respect to decisions. What I can say is that as an organisation and a professional body, CABE has been very forthright in flagging the extent to which building control has already been through extensive change, the impact that has had on both organizational confidence and on individuals in that process, and the critical need to support and respect the value that everyone, both in terms of local authorities, private sector, building control, and individual registered building inspectors brings to helping this system work. It is very clear people are extremely fatigued by uncertainty. And as Hal pointed out in the presentation, it's been made, I think, abundantly clear by many that a further period of uncertainty is going to be deeply, deeply unhelpful and damaging to capacity in the market. Hal, I don't know if you have particular views on this.
Well, I do, but I think you've covered the things that I think are most important here. Um, I would find it staggering if government is not thinking about this. They've got two inquiry recommendations that they have to respond to. Um, there are some ambitious government policy objectives that are going to require more building and more building control capacity, not less. As Richard says, and rightly, they have been very tight-lipped about this, and that's understandable. I think we now have to wait and see what they say when they respond to the inquiry report in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I mean everything. I think what has to happen in relation to all of these recommendations is that there needs to be a careful evaluation of how we deliver positive outcomes. So how we actually build compliance, how we build capability, and how the government goes about doing that. Um, in practical terms, we've got to make these recommendations work. That may mean that they're delivered in a slightly different way to the inquiry has suggested. And we all recognise that the drivers behind those recommendations, but there is a need to make sure that we build on the positives that we have and avoid any further degradation of capability or morale in the building control sector. So I think that's absolutely critical. The next question um, relates to comes from anonymous questionnaire. The business model for some building control bodies is adapting to establish umbrella entities that continue to offer advice. Is this a conflict of interest? Um, I think this is very much something on which the building safety regulator, in terms of its oversight role, is going to need to rule. It's really something that sits within the KPIs and the codes of conduct that are applicable to the various building control bodies. Um, the CABE code of conduct is very clear about members' duties to avoid conflict of interest, or to flag and raise these where they arise. I think that it's implicit that any organization which is providing both building control services and consultancy needs to be extremely clear-sighted and mindful as to how they separate those two functions. But it is not yet clear quite where the BSR sees that line drawn. Hal.
Um, there is a code of conduct for registered building inspectors, which is quite clear on this. But as you say, Richard, in the end, it will come down to the regulator taking a view. They'll take a view by dealing with probably a situation that's brought to their attention and they're asked for a view. And at some point, they're going to issue a ruling on what constitutes a conflict of interest by deeming something to be a conflict of interest. I wouldn't want to be the one who's in the firing line to be the test case. You know, but then I tend to be the sort, if I'm walking on a cliff edge path, I'd prefer to walk a few feet back from the cliff edge than right up close to it. Some may feel they want to walk close to the cliff edge. At some point, somebody's going to find that that they've misjudged, and they may find the regulator imposing significant sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all of these things now, when we talk about issues where ethical or other judgments need to be made on a professional basis, we urge people to adopt the precautionary principle. If you are questioning whether something is right or wrong, that is always already an indicator that you need to perhaps proceed with caution rather than being adventurous. That could be technically, or it can be legally or professionally. But in essence, we need to be very mindful of the way that these risks can play out. Okay, next question. Let me just have a look. Okay, how are contractors being controlled? Will they have to take competency testing in future to show they can work on high-risk buildings? So the duty holding regulations that came into force in the building regulations, I think April 2024, are absolutely explicit about the responsibilities of both contractors and principal contractors. And management of competence is a key element of those duties. Now, there are gateways in the higher risk building system where competence can be assessed by the building safety regulator, and we would expect that over time their expectations in terms of how that's demonstrated will increase as maturity of competence testing in the industry increases. But I think the way the system works in general means that it remains to a large degree up to the contracting organizations to manage and record how they manage competence and competence assessment of their direct labor and supply chain. But I would give again a note of caution. If at some stage a matter of compliance comes before the regulator, those companies and organizations will need to demonstrate effectively that they've met those legal requirements. So it may not be biting outside of HRBs at the moment, but it is something that every contracting organisation needs to be mindful of, and the legal duties to do so already exist. Hal?
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to come at this a slightly different way because I think there's a broader point to be illustrated here. You know, the BSR hasn't got a squad of people driving round, going to a site saying, before you start work this morning, can we check that your contractor is competent? It's not going to work like that. They will start driving round when something goes wrong on a project. Now, if it goes wrong in a way that there is an accident and somebody is injured, they will certainly be piling in, both under CDM and potentially under the building regulations. But if they become aware, they do a site visit on an HRB on site, and they discover things on that site visit that they're not happy with. I'm told that the lift industry has frequent problems with openings on lift shafts being the wrong size. And I had a conversation with somebody at the BSR about this, and I was quite struck by their view. Yes, that might be a mandatory occurrence because it's a significant failing. You're going to have to do something about it in order for the lift landing doors to do their job for fire compartmentation. And so you may need to do some further building work, and that may mean you've got to apply for approval of the change to what you're building from what you designed, because you haven't built what you designed, and it's got significant implications for fire compartmentation. But they then went a step further and said, how's a contractor on an HRB got the holes for the lift landing doors wrong in the first place? What's wrong with their site supervision? They haven't planned, monitored, and managed that work properly, have they? And if they haven't planned, monitored, and managed it properly, I'd like to see some evidence that the person who was meant to plan, manage, and monitor it is competent. So suddenly, a minor cock up or a cock up on the size of the lift landing doors, and the regulator comes in and starts backtracking. Are you really competent? And that is how it's going to get controlled, I think. And at that point, oh dear, we've suddenly got our site shut down. We've got to put in an application to fix this problem on the lift core, and it's got to go to the regulator and be signed off before we can continue. Oh, that's going to stop us working for a number of weeks, and there's going to be some costs involved. Oh, so I think that's the way it's going to get controlled in practice, not by the BSR flying squad running around asking to check people's credentials before they start work on a site on Monday morning.
Yeah, and it's also worth flagging. I mean, there's intervention by the BSR, but contractual obligations are also going to come into play on this. If your
Mm.
appointment as a contractor or a professional requires that you work towards ensuring to whatever degree of proportionality compliance with the building regulations, that encompasses all of these duties to manage competence and plan, manage, monitor, and review compliance of building work. So if you don't have the evidence of that and there is a contractual dispute, you may well already be in breach or unable to prove that you were not in breach of contract. So these are really, really far-reaching implications. And I think very much we would always encourage people to be really proactive in making sure that they are doing the best they can against current expectations of good practice in that respect. Okay, another question here. I think we've partly answered this, but big interest in this. So have indications been provided regarding the model of nationalisation of building control, how likely and how that will align with the current system, the building safety regulator? I'm just going to hand this over to you, Hal.
I absolutely understand the nervousness and the concern behind the question, but I think the honest answer has to be no. I am certain government is thinking about it, but they're not sharing their thinking outside government. And we're going to have to see. That I mean, there is a supposition there that it is nationalised, but right now we've got the recommendations in the report. We know government has to respond to them, and I'm not sure that we know a lot more beyond that right now. What I can say is that there has been unanimity amongst those from a building control background and senior people in the design and contracting side of the industry who have all gone back to government and said, whatever you do about this, you've got to be really careful that you don't make matters a whole lot worse. And we will just have to see how that message lands and what government decides to do. But we have no particular insights into what that might be at this stage. I'm sorry, but that's where we are right now, and I appreciate that's not not as informative as people would like.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's a very difficult position for people trying to plan their kind of individual and organizational future. Um, I think the one bit of good news, perhaps, is that we will know relatively soon what government's thinking is. We should know by March and possibly a little bit earlier. Okay, the next one question. With fire stopping, if the detail does not align with a certified detail, is it acceptable for a considered engineering position, or should a test be undertaken? I am absolutely going to hand this over to you, Hal. I think this is very much your ballpark.
Thank you, Ian. That's a really good question. I think the answer is it depends. You know, what is it a one-off? What are the consequences of that failure? And again, being contractual, um, does your insurance policy or does the insurance policy of somebody taking an engineering view, does it cover them to do that? Um, and then a couple of quite you know, personal things. Um, if that's done, do you really believe, hand on heart, that that's the right answer? And that you can go and say to the building inspector, there was a mistake here. This is what we've done about it, and this is why we believe the solution is genuinely and robustly compliant with the building regulations, and we think it's satisfactory. Or do you think, well, hang on a minute, actually there's a problem here, something needs testing, or bluntly, some work needs to be redone so that it is compliant? There's a range of options there, but at the end of the day, somebody somewhere is going to have to sign on the dotted line that what's been done complies with building regs. And if they're not willing to do that, you've got to go and do something different. Whether it's more testing, whether it's rebuilding work, that will need to be decided.
Yeah, absolutely. It, the all of that we've learned from the inquiry and all of the evidence revealed over time tells us that we have a much more complicated technical environment that we work in. We have a massive array of products and systems that are available. Um, Assumptions around compliance had become distorted and baseline to a large degree. People were willing to accept inadequate evidence that certain systems or elements or solutions were right. And there is now a rebalancing going on where professional judgment needs to be exercised. And that is not easy, particularly given the problems that were highlighted in the report with regards to the construction products sector as a whole. We will get there. We will get a reliable system for construction products and testing, I'm sure, because it is so fundamental. It will take some time, and in the interim, those professional judgments are going to have to be very carefully weighed. Next question from Jane Hall. Good afternoon, Jane. Great to hear from you. The inquiry was thorough and conclusions damning, but do the recommendations go far enough to fix our industry wholesale? Does the message reach the right people? We've already talked about the difficulty in getting messages through to the industry as a whole. It's something we've all got to work at really hard, and we're going to have to do it consistently, and we're going to have to look at changing the message so that it works for the different audiences that exist. In terms of change, I think the inquiry report is quite clear that not the right solutions are not in place across the board, and it's not that the changes that have been made are wrong necessarily, but industry is still adapting to those changes. So we do need to be cautious in trying to judge exactly how much change has happened. It's hard to measure, and there's a lag between legal matters coming into force and industry building to those standards. But it's quite clear from the inquiry report and from what feedback we are getting from the government, that they believe significant further interventions and change is still required. So I think we do need to expect more reform. As I said, we need to try and work to make sure that that's practical and deliverable and actually gets the right outcomes. But I think we have to accept that as an industry that we have fallen so far that change remains inevitable. Hal, I don't know if you have a view.
Well, I do have a view. We need to remember this is an industry of at least 2 million people. And I was reminded, I had the opportunity to listen to Dame Judith give a lecture to the Chartered Institute of Building back in November. And she started off by reminding us that it's the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Health and Safety Executive. And she pointed out both that it took time for the HSE to get up and running and to start to have an impact. It also took time for it to get to grips with the new procedures and processes and approach. And we've got a new approach here with the building safety regulator that is adopting a risk-based proportional approach that looks at outcomes and not what bit of guidance have you followed. It will take time. The HSE was set up in 1974. Actually, I think it was 1975. The Act was 74. The late recently departed John Prescott, when he was Deputy Prime Minister, one of the things he did in 99, 2000 was to drag the construction industry into a summit, show them the figures for fatalities on building sites, which at that time were running at 2 deaths a week. And he basically said to them, look, you lot, this isn't good enough. Does anybody think it is good enough? Well, nobody did think it was good enough. And he said, you've got a year. Go away and work out what you're going to do about it. And you're going to come back and tell me in a year. And if I don't think it's good enough, then we're going to regulate. And the industry did go away, and it did go back with a plan that convinced Mr. Prescott that they were serious. And at one time, we got fatalities on sites down below 40. It's crept back up again, which is not a good thing. I think we're in the same position. If we can't demonstrate to government that as an industry, we are prepared to take the needless loss of 72 lives really seriously and change, and the devastation we've caused with all the other dodgy work that's affecting another 4 million people. If we don't come up with a convincing story to tell, then yes, I think we are going to see more regulatory change. And who knows where that will lead.
Thank you. Okay, so this is going to be I'm mindful of the time. Final question, not an easy one necessarily, but final question nonetheless. Reference has been made to choice of regulator, building control in a negative light. Could you elaborate on this and if you believe there are positives to the mixed market? Okay, so one of the reasons that private sector building control was introduced or expanded in terms of use was to address what was seen as kind of poor levels of service delivery from purely public sector function. That has changed and developed progressively over 40 years. And I think it is fair to say that government during that period did not do enough to put balancing safeguards in place as it expanded the role of the private sector to ensure that the system as a whole functioned to a high standard. That is not an inherent criticism of the private sector. It is about, in my view, a fundamental failing to modify the system to capture the benefits that were identified and obtained. There's a general view, I think, that the private sector, in many cases, does a great job, in the same way that there are some very good local authorities. But in both cases, there are building control bodies that perhaps could do better. The question the government has raised or has to address, sorry, arising from public inquiry findings is how do we get the best out of the building control system? Do we need to make changes Do we need to modify the way that we control works to address any weaknesses that have been identified in the inquiry? What we have been clear with in our responses to government is that the private sector, in one form or another, has to remain critical to delivering capacity in terms of knowledge and interpretation and understanding into the market to support the level of activity that the government wants. Hal, your thoughts?
Very simply, I've said all along that everything we've learned from Grenfell tells us that we need more building control capacity, not less. Whatever we do and however we reform building control, we need to be really clear that we need more building control activity and that reforms that are likely to drive people out of the sector, unless there are very good reasons. No, if somebody is clearly utterly incompetent, they shouldn't be in the sector. But barring those exceptions, we can't afford to push more people out of the building control sector. We need to find ways in which we can deliver a good building control system, harnessing the talents and the benefits of private sector and public sector provision. And we need to have a level playing field so that if somebody does go to a private sector inspector as a client and they want to try it on and the client wants to be a bad actor and game the system needs to support the building control people in the private sector to call that out and to put a stop to it. And I think that's an area that's quite difficult at the moment. And we need to give some thought to how we tackle that.
Thank you. Okay, mindful of the time, we've now come to the end of the session as proposed. I'm going to call time on the questions there. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, everyone who's been here. A couple of kind of final notes. Next slide, please. Just note there are some upcoming webinars from some great speakers. Hywel will be talking about building notices, applications, and approvals. And we have a webinar from our new insurance provider on how to present your business to get the best insurance terms for your PII on the 19th of February. So please do think about booking onto those events. Next slide, please. I just want to note for everyone who's a member of CABE to have a look at our competence management system. It's free to use for all CABE members to assist in demonstrating and developing and demonstrating their competence over time. It currently includes both the CABE competence framework and the CBICAS framework for building inspectors and is a real cornerstone of how we are going to support our members in the longer term. Next slide, please. And I would promote to anyone who's not a CABE member already, please do think about joining us. The more of us there are to work together, the faster we're going to deliver the change that we need in industry as a whole. So please, if you're interested in joining, look at our website, get in touch with our membership team, and get the information you need to become a member, which I would wholeheartedly encourage. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attendance today. I'd like to thank Hywel and all of the team at HQ for their support in putting this on. And I hope that what we've discussed today is helpful in informing your own professional journey. Thank you very much.